Hello, I'm Yerevan. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. For 3 decades, Armenia and Azerbaijan have been defined by war, distrust and closed borders. Turkey, tied to Baku by history and energy pipelines, kept its frontier with Armenia sealed since the 1990s. But now, after a Washington-brokered breakthrough, there is talk of peace treaties, open trade and even restored railway links. The big question is whether this long-frozen conflict is finally thawing, or if old ghosts will return to haunt the region. So let's get into the story of where Armenia is heading towards today. Without further ado, it's time to look at our latest report to find out more.
Turkey and Armenia look set on restarting relations between each other despite their difficult shared history. At the recent NATO Parliamentary Assembly, an MP from Turkish President Erdogan's party held the beginning of a new chapter between the two countries. Recent media reports indicate that Armenia is ready to open its borders with Turkey if Ankara agrees, as both countries seek to establish proper relations. The border has been closed since 1993 at Turkey's behest, and the countries have not held diplomatic relations. Armenia and Turkey have been negotiating opening the border to citizens of third countries since 2022, but so far nothing has been agreed on. Normalizing relations between Turkey and Armenia is seen as a huge step forward for security in the South Caucasus. For Ankara, it means becoming a role player in global affairs, a prestigious position Turkey has coveted for some time, as shown by its peacemaking efforts regarding the war in Ukraine. For Armenia, however, the most subtle benefit lies within the North Atlantic Alliance. After Yerevan's relations with Russia soured in the wake of Azerbaijan's conquest of Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia has become more inclined towards pursuing partnerships with the wider West, including NATO. Senior Armenian lawmaker Andranik Kocharin says that the country has been in talks with NATO over an individually tailored partnership program, a key element of Armenia's security. Armenia's involvement with NATO includes carrying out reforms in its defense and security sectors, strengthening civilian oversight, and taking part in international peacekeeping missions.
And now let's zone in on the east-plaining portion of our show. One of the most important developments in Armenia's relations with its neighbors has been the pledge to sign a peace deal with Azerbaijan. The two countries have been rivals for decades, and their conflict has been a point of destabilization for the entire region.
In August, during a state visit to Washington, D.C., Armenia and Azerbaijan signed an agreement aimed to end the decades of conflict between them. While the landmark deal was not a formal peace treaty, it did build up hopes for a diffusion of tensions in the region. The agreement also entailed the reopening of key transport and trade routes between the countries and the establishment of a transit corridor overseen by the United States. The input the US president had in facilitating the agreement has been praised by both sides, though he himself sometimes seems to forget who he had actually been brokering a peace deal for.
To think that we settled Azerbaijan and Albania as an example, it was going on for years. It was never going to be settled.
The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been centered on the Nagorno-Karabakh region. The situation between them collapsed in the wake of Azerbaijan's conquest of the area in September 2023. Since then, however, both sides have been striving to achieve some sort of agreement, as Armenia has been focused on creating new partnerships in the wake of its partial withdrawal from the Russian sphere of influence.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. For much of modern history, Armenia and Azerbaijan have stood on opposite sides of a hostile border, their political and cultural destinies locked in the shadow of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Turkey, meanwhile, chose solidarity with Baku over engagement with Yerevan, sealing its frontier in the early 1990s. What followed was a geopolitical freeze, decades of mistrust, isolation and missed opportunities. But today, for the first time in years, there is real movement. Now, fast forward to 2 weeks ago. The 12th of September, Armenian and Turkish envoys crossed into Armenia through a border that has been shuttered for over 3 decades. Serdar Kilic, Turkey's special envoy, and Ruben Rubinian, Armenia's deputy speaker of parliament, agreed to keep normalization talks alive. They spoke of opening trade routes, restoring rail links between Kars and Gyumri, and even establishing educational and cultural exchanges. For a region long defined by walls, this new diet of opening of bridges is something of a novelty. However, the normalization between Armenia and Turkey is inseparable from the peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Ankara has made it clear: no final settlement with Yerevan until Armenia and Azerbaijan formally sign a peace treaty. And Azerbaijan has its own conditions: constitutional amendments in Armenia that would erase disputed language seen as territorial claims, and the full guarantee of transit rights to Nakhchivan through what Baku calls the Zangezur corridor and what Washington now brands the Trump route for international peace and prosperity. Still, symbolic gestures do matter. The Armenian side agreed to remove Mount Ararat from its border stamps, a move widely interpreted as an olive branch. Humanitarian aid has crossed the border both ways in times of crisis. The political calculus behind this thaw is equally important. For Pashinyan, who swept to power in 2018 but has seen his popularity collapse in the years since, peace is not just foreign policy, it is survival. He has bet his political future on delivering a deal before the 2026 parliamentary elections. Aliyev also stands to benefit from cementing his 2020 military victory into a permanent diplomatic triumph. And Erdogan sees in this process a chance to boost Turkey's regional leadership while easing Western scrutiny. What makes this time different now is that Russia, long the security guarantor in the South Caucasus, is distracted and weakened by its war in Ukraine. For decades now, the South Caucasus stands at a crossroads, but the breakthrough in Washington has created a ripple effect that could reshape the entire region. On the other hand, the promise of peace between Armenia, Azerbaijan and Turkey is closer than it has been in a generation. But whether this thaw will hold, or whether old patterns of mistrust will return, depends on choices made in the coming months.
Hello and welcome to TVP World here. I'm Diana Skaya coming to you from Yerevan, Armenia at the 108th Rose Roth Seminar, part of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And my guest here today is Richard Giragosyan, the founding director of the Regional Study Center. Richard, so glad to finally meet you in person and have you here with us on TVP World face to face. Now, Richard, this is quite an important seminar that's taking place today. What we're actually seeing and witnessing for, I would say, one of the first time ever is Armenians. There is an Azerbaijani delegation and a Turkish delegation here discussing about the future and the geopolitical situation of the South Caucasus. Now, so far, and what we've heard here, what are the key takeaways from this seminar?
Well, first of all, the key takeaway is exactly what you pinpointed, and that is the timing of this particular meeting of NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which is hosted by Armenia, comes in a very new geopolitical context of post-war diplomacy. In other words, Armenia and its neighbor Azerbaijan reached a breakthrough diplomatic agreement this past August, making this particular meeting all the more significant, both for the Armenian host, but also for the parliamentary delegations, especially those from Turkey and the one representative from Azerbaijan.
Richard, you did speak here. You are a speaker at the parliamentary session. What did your speech focus on?
Well, I focused on the geopolitical context, but arguing it's increasingly more local and regional issues and much less a geopolitical battle. My point is that Russia remains both distracted and overwhelmed by its failed invasion of Ukraine, giving Armenia and Azerbaijan a rare window of opportunity to move forward and resolve conflict and forge diplomatic relations without Russian interference. At the same time, we also see local politics, the democracy underway in Armenia, being crucial to ensure a lasting, durable peace. And finally, we also see a breakthrough agreement over a road and rail connection between Azerbaijan running through southern Armenia and onto Turkey, demonstrating the need for economic interdependence as the most effective way to regain deterrence and prevent a renewal of hostilities in the South Caucasus region.
In other words, I believe what you are talking about is the Zangezur corridor, what many know it as, right? Or what most recently President Trump will be named the Trump route for peace and prosperity. Richard, since they signed since the signing of that agreement between President Ilham Aliyev, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, and President Trump, what has actually moved forward?
That's a good question. Since the signing ceremony in the White House on this road and rail connectivity agreement, we do see a significant meeting, the beginning of negotiations between Armenian and Azerbaijani representatives over the details and the operational technical aspects of these connections. What we also see is progress in the related area of border demarcation and delineation. What's most important is the big picture. Armenia is now much closer to peace, and Azerbaijan much further away from threatening war, in contrast to the rather difficult post-war environment. Azerbaijan has returned to diplomacy, and Armenia has emerged as a reliable interlocutor and negotiator. In this context, the outlook for regional stability is greatly improved.
Let me ask you this. So you are talking about Azerbaijan here. The fact that lately we've been seeing deteriorating relations between Moscow and Baku, is this actually helping Azerbaijan wanting to open the path to diplomacy?
It's not just helping Azerbaijan, it's helping Armenia, to be honest. Because of the nature of government in neighboring Azerbaijan, which is very much a father-to-son dynasty, it's very authoritarian, there is now a change in the political domestic discourse. The new enemy for Azerbaijan, especially in terms of domestic politics, has become Russia and is much less Armenia in terms of the demonization of Armenia by the Azerbaijani authorities. This is something significantly new, also reflects an escalation of tension between Moscow and Baku.
How do you see this NATO seminar helping both Armenia and Azerbaijan and into their path for normalization? And is it safe to say reconciliation?
This particular NATO event only demonstrates and reaffirms the need to focus on domestic stability and democratization as much as security. And in this way, there's more pressure on Azerbaijan to meet expectations in the wake of these agreements. However, it is far too soon and premature to define this as reconciliation. Rather, this is normalizing relations. Armenia and Azerbaijan, like Armenia and Turkey, do not have diplomatic relations. This, therefore, is the first step in the bigger process of reconciliation. An important first step, but rather modest in terms of simply normalizing relations between two neighboring states.
And how do you see NATO, partnerships, monitoring and maintaining security and preventing further escalation between, if ever it were to happen again, which of course we hope not, between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
That's a very good question, because I do not see a role for NATO yet. In other words, NATO's primary function, its most effective engagement in the region, is working separately with the armed forces of Armenia in terms of defense reform, developing more of a territorial defense, and much less giving Azerbaijan grounds or justification for renewed hostilities. In other words, NATO engagement is still dangerously provocative. In this context, it's too soon to really forecast a role for NATO in preventing hostilities, because the other side of this coin is Russia's reaction. We do see a closing window of opportunity where at some point a resurgent Russia will seek to regain its lost power and influence in the South Caucasus. And NATO engagement is not the answer. It's rather resilience and the ability for Armenia and Azerbaijan to resist Russian pressure.
Richard, let me ask you this. I mean, we've been seeing Armenia. I mean, today Yerevan hosts this Rose-Roth seminar. We've seen Armenia also take certain steps, but I really do want to ask you, what steps is Azerbaijan taking into this path? And I will say reconciliation, not normalization ties. And my question is based on the fact that just recently, we found out that beginning the 1st of November, Armenian passports will no longer feature the symbolic Mount Ararat in its passport stamps. Now, to many Armenians, of course, this represents a huge symbol of their nation, a huge symbol of their pride. Is this happening because of its relation to Turkey or to normalization steps, or is this completely irrelevant?
I think a little bit of both. In other words, I would argue on the one hand, yes, any symbolic erosion or downgrading of the sacred symbol of Mount Ararat could be perceived, right or wrong, as a blow to Armenian statehood and identity. However, at the same time, in this particular case, it's more of an international standard of passports. In other words, this step follows Armenia's earlier commitment to the adoption and transformation to biometric passports. In other words, the stamp itself, whether it was Mount Ararat or some other symbol, is part of a neutral process and much less directed to please Turkey. At the same time, the Armenian government does need to do a better job to define in order to defend such a policy.
How so?
They need to, for example, articulate why is this happening, what international standard is it related to, rather than the misperception that this is a unilateral move by the Armenian government, which it's not.
Richard, I want to ask you, how is Russia viewing this closeness of developing ties between now Azerbaijan, Armenia? Does Russia think it's losing the South Caucasus?
I would be rather provocative in terms of arguing Russia's reaction to this White House ceremony and this agreement was uncharacteristically passive and pensive, meaning that for some reason, Russia doesn't take this as a direct threat. I would also argue analytically, the reason is Russia sees an opportunity post-Ukraine where it can regain its lost leverage by playing a role in managing the trade and transport links. Such a more sophisticated emphasis on Russian leverage and influence is actually more welcome by Moscow than reverting to traditional hard power. In other words, without Nagorno-Karabakh, the frozen conflict, Russia's leverage is less. Therefore, the implication from a Russian role in the interdependence of Armenia and Azerbaijan will maximize Russia's position.
And Richard, just very briefly, and my final question to you, I will make this comparison. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has many times said and stated that he sees a new Middle East. Now, I want to ask you, how do you see this new, or are we witnessing a new South Caucasus with all these latest unfolding developments here?
Well, yes, I think it's clear and fair to say the South Caucasus has already achieved a seismic change in terms of the geopolitical landscape. Unlike the Middle East, this is a much more positive transformation. And I do think the one positive game changer will actually be the reopening of the closed border between Armenia and Turkey, and normalization of relations between those two countries, which will come next.
Thank you so much, Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Study Center. Thank you for being with us here on TVP.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. I'm Diana Skaya, here live from Yerevan, Armenia, at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Salaries in the Russian defense sector have fallen for the first time since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This drop comes despite average salaries across Russia being on the rise.
The defense industry is currently the most important one in Russia, bar the energy sector. Yet despite this importance, a recent report by an exiled Russian media outlet says that advertised salaries in the Russian defense sector were down by 10% in August 2025 compared to the same month in 2024. Ever since Russia began its illegal invasion of Ukraine, salaries in this sector have been on the rise, experiencing their biggest surge in the war's early months when there was a sharp increase in state orders, which in turn created a labor shortage. Yet in 2025, Russia's defense ministry claimed that factories cannot expand output solely by hiring more workers and adding overtime. What's more, the number of open positions has also dropped this year compared to previous ones. In fact, the current number of job openings in the last 3 months is lower than prior to the invasion.
The Moldovan police has carried out an extensive crackdown operation on suspected Russian election interference. The country's authorities have raided over 250 sites, which they believe have such connections.
Less than a week ahead of its parliamentary elections, Moldovan authorities are doing what they can to ensure that Moscow does not meddle with the results. The country's police force says it has raided more than 250 locations across the entire country in what was a sweep against multiple suspected Russian-backed efforts aimed at destabilizing the country. The raids targeted more than 100 people in 4 prisons and were part of criminal investigation into alleged plans of mass unrest. Former Moldovan President Igor Dodon and the co-leader of the pro-Russian Patriotic Electoral Bloc says that some of his party members were targeted in the raids. Moldovan President Maia Sandu has long accused Moscow of trying to destabilize the country through disinformation campaigns and measures such as vote buying. The Kremlin has denied these accusations.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.